Plugin ICA recognizes that land acknowledgements are living documents and a part of an ongoing dialogue with the indigenous nations whose territory plugin benefits from. We acknowledge that plugin ICA is located on the territory of the Niuyak, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, the Lakota, the Nakota, the Anishinaabe, and the Dene nations. Plugin is located on the national homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. As an ICA, Plugin is committed to acknowledging colonial histories, and we are actively working to interrogate the systematic colonial ways of being that have kept many Indigenous and people of color out of our conversations. We are dedicated to deconstructing systematic oppression within our gallery walls. We express immense gratitude to the Indigenous nations for being able to live on these lands and waters. We source our water from Shoal Lake Band 40. Tom Kohut is a writer and theorist presently living in Winnipeg. Among his other work, he is the co-editor of the Marcia McLuhan and Vilém Flossier's Communication and Aesthetic Theories Revisited. He is currently working on psychoanalysis and contemporary Canadian media art.
God help me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Why are you here? Anyways, let's begin. So I should start off by sort of reiterating the sentiments and words that Alison just expressed vis-a-vis sort of living on the realities of living on Treaty 1 territory, as I have for the lion's share of my life, and that requires a certain responsibility, recognition. I need hardly point out that the bodies in the landfill are still there. So after that rather solemn statement, but when it is meant, what I'm going to do today is bring into conjunction two concepts of Todestrieb, death drive, and recursion, and recursivity. And in so doing, I hope to be illuminating a somewhat baneful possibility concerning the current technical conjunction. Although I should emphasize, lest people think that I'm some sort of doomsayer, which I am not, that this is only one possibility among others, and there. So this might be taken more as a sort of saying, watch out, more than anything else. My ability to sort of forecast the future is terrible, as I can promise you all. I thought COVID would be done and dusted by July 2020. I was very wrong. And this is also, I mean, and also I should point out that this particular synthesis is something fairly new to me. It's part of a larger project, and so I'm kind of using you as guinea pigs for this sort of set of arguments I'll be putting forth. So we'll be able to illuminate parts that are perhaps obscure or that I haven't quite sort of like articulated as clearly, hopefully in the Q&A afterwards and in subsequent discussions. So that preamble accomplished, let's start. We'll start by talking about death drive, Todestrieb. So in 1920, Freud published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he introduced two related concepts of compulsion to repeat, repetition compulsion, and death drive. There's a slight translation issue in which Todestrieb is rendered by James Strachey, who was the English translator of the canon of Freud's works, as death instinct, and there are reasons why this is not a good thing, and I will get to that more promptly in a bit. Not the least of which because there's a perfectly good German word for instinct, which is instinct, oddly enough. So let's start off with the first one, the compulsion to repeat. When Freud was writing Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he was much engaged with treating, as you know, in the late or early. This is 1920 when he published it, so he had been working on returning World War I veterans who were suffering from what was known at the time as war neuroses, and was struck by something that seemed at odds with the sort of like standard psychoanalytic theory, namely, and this is the beyond the pleasure principle aspect, that in dreams and in sort of the neurotic symptoms, these soldiers, former soldiers, would repeat actions that would have been highly traumatic, unpleasurable. And this was at odds with the sort of pleasure principle of psychoanalysis, which defines pleasure negatively. People point this out all the time as a sort of decrease in unpleasure, understood as a sort of organic overstimulation. And then, but he also noticed that something similar seemed to be happening in some of the children he was observing, notably his grandson, who doesn't seem to have liked very much, but says terrible things about him. So this was not necessarily something specific to, somebody like suffering a terrible trauma of the nature of like a, trench warfare. But that sort of the unpleasure of this activity contradicted this basic sort of like pleasure principle of sort of like a relative degree of decrease in organic stimulation. How is this possible? Why are these traumatic experiences repeated and continually? Now, on the one hand, Freud does aver that there's an element of being able to master the traumatic content through its repetition, be able to sort of like incorporate it into one's sort of psychic apparatus. But Freud seems more struck by the degree of as it were, the pleasurable unpleasurable, that repeating a modulated forms of these traumatic experiences afforded a degree of satisfaction. And hence it becomes, in Freud's own words, a compulsion to repeat. And why and how it affords this satisfaction and how it relates very closely to repetition, I hope will become clear very shortly. So, so much for repetition compulsion. As for death drive, Todestrieb, the section where he actually starts talking about it, however gingerly, he starts off with a sentence that has become somewhat famous, sort of where he says, and I quote, "What follows is speculation, often far-fetched speculation, which the reader will consider or dismiss according to his predilection." Now, while repetition compulsion is a fairly easy concept to provide a succinct formulation, it becomes a bit more difficult with death drive. One might say it's one of those sort of like a concept similar to noise yesterday, of a sort of a concept that exceeds its own articulation in some ways. So he approaches this problem through a long route that begins with some speculative biology, highly speculative biology, derived from certain books by nature philosopher, biologist August Weismann, two books in particular on the duration of life and on germ plasma, in which Freud postulates sort of what amounts to a kind of creation story, in which a vesicule, as the saying goes, of organic material scissions off from an inorganic milieu. Now, in order to keep itself alive and protect itself from a sort of inrush of external stimuli, it forms a hard shell around itself, allowing part of itself to effectively die or to become organic in order to protect itself. Now, at one level, Freud uses this as a kind of metaphor for psyche and the development of ego instincts. The ego submits itself to a relative degree of becoming inorganic in order to protect itself. But as Freud notes, this metaphor has certain limits insofar as the ego is not only in danger of being overwhelmed by external stimuli, but also from experiences, but from internal stimuli, the various demands of the id and the superego, for example, which were concepts he was also developing roughly at the same time. And thus, he states that a tendency towards the inorganic when he said the sort of like death of the death drive, suffuses the whole development of the psychoanalytic ego as such. So that's the Tod in Todestrieb. As for the Trieb in Todestrieb, where to begin with this? In classical Freudian psychoanalysis, there are three types of drives associated with three areas of the body: oral, anal, and genital. That Freud regards these drives as developmental, that, you know, one progresses from the first to the last in a normal course of development, if such a thing is possible, which in Freud it really isn't. One can sort of take or leave. They're not developmental in my consideration. In addition to being associated with specific organs or parts of the body, drives have one particular characteristic in common, that they find their satisfaction in their repetition. So, for example, I mean, he wrote a lot about sort of miserliness or sort of profligacy being related to anal drives, and the fact that they're able to sort of like almost develop a kind of characterology connected to them is related to the sort of the repetition that these drives engender, and that is their sort of raison d'etre. And this is one of the reasons why this Strachey translation of Trieb as instinct is, rather than drive, is so satisfactory. It is true that Freud, in the course of, you know, some 40 years of writing, is not always as precise as he might have been with respect to distinctions between instincts and drives. But there is one sort of main distinction that is pretty stable throughout his works. Instincts are kind of biological defaults, like hunger, fight or flight reflexes, that are satisfied, and then they're achieved, and when they're achieved, when, you know, one is no longer eaten, or one is no longer hungry, one is no longer feeling under threat, that's it. They're done. They're satisfied, and they don't bother the person anymore, the psychic apparatus anymore. Drives, on the other hand, do. Their repetition is their point. So the satisfaction in repetition is what connects Todestrieb to the repetition compulsion. Satisfaction in the repetition of a traumatic experience, however modulated, is precisely the kind of sort of homeopathic self-murder that Freud characterized as sort of like this inaugural moment of the development of organic life as such, in which a sort of tendency towards inorganicism is brought into the psychic domain in order to maintain a continuation of the ego as such. This is why Freud will emphasize that the collection of things associated with the death drive are associated always with ego instincts. The ego requires ongoing support to protect itself from being overwhelmed or full-on annihilated by external and internal stimuli. In a slightly different vocabulary, one could say that Todestrieb is the motor of pursuit of life by means other than life. So, one moment, please. To recapitulate then, Todestrieb or death drive is not, as it got later taken, as a kind of biological default towards aggression or destruction. That being said, it can help with that and provide a sort of motor. Freud noting that the difficulty with Todestrieb, which makes it so difficult to articulate, is that it very rarely or almost never found in a pure state, that it often entwines itself with other instincts, including aggressive ones. Now, I say that it isn't generally taken, but partly because of the Strachey translation, also because Freud seems to sort of back away from the more Freudian aspects, or the more sort of difficult, more Freudian aspects of Todestrieb. Most notably in, for example, Civilization and His Discontents, where he sort of comes up with this sort of cosmology of sort of Eros and Thanatos, which Eros binds thanatos, tears asunder. And it would be largely, and thereafter in the psychoanalytic literature, this would be how death drive instinct would be understood. For example, Melanie Klein or Erich Fromm, however much they agree. But if we take drive seriously in death drive, there is a question. We've figured out that it repeats itself, but what organ or area of the body is it associated with? Now, Freud doesn't really answer this in pleasure principle, but Lacan, as it turns out, provides a not uncharacteristically ambiguous answer. So, this will be a very short sort of canter through Lacan. In his 1964 seminar, Lacan's 1964 seminar, The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis, which are, as it turns out, unconscious, repetition, transference, and drive, and then he adds another two, subject and the real. Lacan introduces a figure of lamella, which he'll introduce exactly once and then kind of largely drop it using this particular term, lamella, about which he says, this is a quote, "This lamella, this organ, whose characteristic is not to exist as an organ, but is nevertheless an organ, is the libido. Libido, that is to say," and this is a quote again, "immortal or life, or irrepressible life, life that has no need of an organ, simplified, indestructible life." So it's a kind of undifferentiated organicism, one that doesn't really have a shape. He'll make a joke about calling it the omelette with an H in it, so there's sort of a French pun in there of like sort of like man, homme, and omelette. So, but anyways, to get back to being serious, lamella as organless organ, as it were, or non-organ organ, is described in this seminar as a sort of motor for, as a motor for the drives. It is what attaches itself to the various parts of the body in order to generate the drives associated with them. Now, all well and good, but what does this have to do with Todestrieb exactly? Well, in an earlier seminar, when he did in 1959 to 1960, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan will claim that the Todestrieb is the pure principle of repetition, repetition as such, and therefore, as qua repetition, underlies all the other drives. Hence, I think it is possible to assert that if the lamella is the organ of the libido, and Todestrieb is pure repetition, both of which underlie drives as such, and one can associate Todestrieb with this organless organ or non-organ organ of that particular drive. Now, this has an important consequence, which is how is it that the death drive is correlated with an organ of, again, immortal or irrepressible life. One way to approach this would be to give an example of Todestrieb in a comparatively pure state or a speculative state, as Freud does in an essay, The Uncanny, which he was writing at the same time and refers to Beyond the Pleasure Principle quite explicitly. This is a fairly well-known essay about Hoffman and sort of feelings of unheimlich, uncanny feelings. Among other things in this essay, he gives us an example of something that often, like almost always, inspires these sort of feelings of the uncanny, of which one in particular is of note. I'm going to make this point and then I'm going to drop it for a bit, but it'll come back. It's a repetition compulsion, after all. Doubts whether an apparently animate being, so this is an example, include doubts of whether an apparently animate being is really alive, or conversely, whether a lifeless object might not be animate or inanimate, given further instantiations as waxwork figures. These are quotes again. Ingeniously constructed dolls or automata, people suffering from, say, epileptic fits or other illnesses which, again, quote, excite in the spectator the impression of automatic, mechanical processes at work behind the ordinary mechanism of organic activity. Okay, so this will come back. Now I'm going to move on to recursion, which is a relatively more straightforward concept. From typically computer science, and it is used very often to describe, in particular, the action of algorithms that develop positive feedback loops in order to adjust themselves in the process of their operation to the achievement of particular predetermined goals. A significant feature of the recursive algorithm is its halting program, in which feedback loops comes to an end once a particular result or state has been achieved. This also will become important. The significance of these algorithms is their centrality to cybernetics, both first or second order cybernetics, and its sort of postulation of self-regulating and, after a while, self-perpetuating machines. However, there is an additional feature to the science of cybernetics that is crucial for our discussion here, and this is particularly drawn up by Yuk Hui's book, Recursivity and Contingency. Particularly draws the attention to this, which is specifically Norbert Wiener's challenge to the traditional opposition in the philosophy of nature between mechanism and a sort of organicism. In the 1948 book Cybernetics, this is discussed in terms of an overcoming of the difference between the Newtonian mechanistic understanding of nature, basically as a clock, big clockwork device that runs away, and the philosophy of élan vital and sort of the non-reversible biological understanding or evolutionary understanding of time associated with Henri Bergson creative evolution. Now, this overcoming is not a sort of transvaluation precisely, but it is a supersession. Cybernetics would, Pachi Wiener, would replace the allegedly outdated distinction between the sort of inorganicism latent in the idea of nature as a law-bound mechanism, purely physical chemical laws, and nature as a creative force, just capable of renewal and so on. Effectively, the cybernetic philosophy of nature would do both at the same time. It would be a self-regulating system that would be able to achieve relative degrees of self-creation while not being necessarily in and of itself purely organic. This is when they start talking about living machines. So Hui, again, who makes great claims about cybernetics and its continuing sort of relevance. She basically says it's the current condition for philosophizing generally, and in particular thinking about sort of philosophy of nature. It will claim that the cybernetic philosophy of nature is understood, and this is his term, as a form of mechanized organicism, a theory of the organic that is underscored by the sort of the physical-chemical mechanism, but is allowed some of the principles that underlie, the organic, i.e. that is self-determining, self-organized, self-directed, and so on. And while this may seem purely metaphoric, or at least an analogical relation, organized inorganic mechanisms behaving as if they were alive and vice versa, it does underlie the algorithmic recursions that are central to cybernetics, with this sort of emphasis, particularly in the sort of what's called second order cybernetics. We'll get to that a bit more, with its emphasis on regulated evolution, for which the concept of the sort of the positive feedback loop is central. And it's remained central, certainly, in like concepts of machine learning, which is how Alan Turing, for example, understood artificial intelligence in the first place, or for example, how Google works. So there is then a relative degree of the blurring between the organic and the inorganic. At the very least, one can be understood in terms of the other, and vice versa. Now, here comes the million-dollar question. What does this have to do with Todestrieb and repetition compulsion? Now, it is true that all that repeats is not necessarily recursive. A recursive structure, algorithmic or otherwise, changes itself as it sort of folds back into itself. It's sort of its self-reflexivity, which is why Hui points out that the generalized notion of the algorithm, if you try to describe an algorithm, generally people say it's a kind of recipe, which is true and untrue simultaneously. It's true in the sense that, yes, it is a set of processes, it's a set of instructions aimed at achieving a certain result. Pardon me. But on the other hand, it is also true that a recursive algorithm, unlike most recipes anyways, is able to represent itself to itself. This is the positive feedback loop that alters itself with each sort of recursive turn, and hence its capacity for self-development, self-creation to some degree. This is connected to the explicit reference equivalence that Hui makes between positive feedback, self-augmenting feedback loops, and recursivity that Hui is arguing for. Now, I'm going to argue that the action of Todestrieb represents an extreme case of recursivity from two perspectives. Okay, first of all, causality. Recursive causality is a pretty, peculiar thing, and the temporality of the death drive is equally peculiar. Starting with recursion as a feedback loop, determining the precise temporal order of a recursive algorithm or process seems to allow, at least sort of at the level of phenomenology, for an apparent reversal of the usual causal structure in which we sort of understand a cause. First there's a cause, then there's an effect. They don't happen simultaneously. An effect doesn't precede its cause, doesn't cause its own self to emerge. This is the billiard ball mechanism, a causality of mechanism. And this is not what these algorithmic recursive algorithms do. They sort of pull themselves out by their own bootstraps, as it were. So there's a degree to which the idea of recursion allows for effects and causes to achieve a certain degree of temporal unmooring or unlockedness, which is a terrible neologism. So too, with the temporality of the Todestrieb, in which effects and causes also seem to lose their normal, quote-unquote, connection. So an example of this type of repetition or recursion, I'm going to argue, that is characteristic of death drive is one that Freud gives in Beyond the Pleasure Principle of a certain woman whose life was plagued by the fact that she would marry these apparently perfectly healthy men who would almost, like within 5 years, become parlously ill and require her to take up the position of a sort of nurse. Freud is careful to note that there's no way she could have known this, that these people that these fellows that she was marrying, even unconsciously, she couldn't have made this as a sort of as any kind of deliberate decision. Freud sort of gets a bit, well, okay, let's just leave it at that. Similarly, and this is a particularly tricky part, and this has to do with the sort of speculative biology part of the pleasure principle, which I alluded to earlier, about the organic vesicule detaching itself from an organic milieu and then allowing part of itself to return to an organic state. At times, Freud does seem to endorse the idea that this is a primordial repetition related to, as August Weismann, whom I mentioned earlier, is related to, as per August Weismann's contention, that there is a degree of immortality to this kind of like primordial life. This is a very tricky part, and I haven't quite figured out all the sort of like details of it, given that it flies in the face of a lot of contemporary, like now, life sciences. But Freud nevertheless seems to be basing on his speculations on the fact that the core of the germ plasma, as per Weismann, does not change its structure, or is not subject to evolutionary processes, or even at a certain level, even processes of generation and decay associated with more complex life forms and systems. hence the recursive aspect of the death drive. The second point has to do with feedback loops and the halting program. To sort of run through it again, positive feedback loops allow for the algorithm to enhance its operations up to a certain point. Then they stop, having achieved a predetermined state or set of states or parameter. And that's all well and good, except there aren't just positive feedback loops, which were an important part of the sort of second order of cybernetics associated with, say, Heinz von Feuster, for example. There are also negative feedback loops that seek to achieve homeostatic state, which is sort of a prime concept in sort of the first order of cybernetics. W. Rosh Ashby sort of had a machine that Wiener was really taken by. That would achieve would not have an internally correlated halting program, and would not be bound by an internal. It wouldn't have an internally correlated halting program. The homeostatic process. It would just basically go to a certain state or result, or a set of results, and not really move from them, not change. So one can certainly argue that Todestrieb operates by means of this sort of homeostatic equilibrium, a position in which the internal and external tension within an organism is lowered to a certain range in accordance with the pleasure principle, but not so far to remove all tensions whatsoever, which would be a complete return to the inorganic, aka death. It is in this sense that I'm arguing that the death drive, as a negative feedback loop, lacks the halting program of the recursive algorithm, or a certain kind of, or at least certainly characterizes certain kinds of recursive algorithms that are central to sort of the present technological situation. So, for these two reasons, causal unlocking associated with both Todestrieb and recursive algorithm, and the lack of halting program, that I argue that that death drive and its technological instantiation run the risk of de-differentiating the organic and the inorganic as such. To sort of reiterate the sort of demurral that I started all this with, this is not an inevitable result, organic or algorithmic technologies as such, but it is a possibility, one signaled by Donna Haraway's sort of warning in her Cyborg Manifesto, in which sort of contemporary technological machines have made thoroughly ambiguous the difference between natural and artificial, mind and body, self-developing and externally designed, and many other distinctions that used to apply to organisms and machines. Our machines are disturbingly lively, and we ourselves are frighteningly inert. Hopefully, in the discussion to follow, we will be able to elaborate on some of these points, though. Thank you. Are my filters funny, at least? Oh, well, story of my life. Shoot. Yes. Now the time of interrogation begins. We'll have time to talk about this later on in the other room. Yeah, that's from Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That's in Freud. That's the part that he starts off with saying that these are purely speculations, and which has sort of become a sentence, become famous last words. Yeah, Well, it is. There is something kind of pataphysical about what he's doing there. So, yeah. Yeah, it's sort of a creation story, really, of just sort of like how organic life started, and did it just kind of happen at a random process, and then this sort of whole thing just kind of like started rattling along, or was there? This is the part that I sort of had in and then took out because it's very speculative indeed about sort of the degree to which the idea of death drive precedes organic life as such, which has its attractions and detractions, one can say. The precise articulation does have to do with some things like the idea of that embryonic life recapitulates all the stages of its evolution and its sort of like process of growing, which turns out to be untrue. And you know, this idea of that sort of like the core of germ plasma stay quasi-immortal, I guess, or just they don't respond to the normal processes of generation and decay that characterize life generally. So I'm not answering your question.
Well, no, I didn't.
Yeah.
Where I was, we go to question sort of, you kind of have to talk about, I'm trying to make a connection to death drive, maybe down temporarily or versus this like aspect of the organic, making itself inorganic in order to create a shell or a mechanism that divides the cell portal, makes the cell portal distinction, or sustain that boundary, you know, that thing. For like inorganic.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's very much so. Yes.
Sort of, and so the death drive is sort of like, in some really speculative sense, it's like, I think you said it's like magnification of that movement to sort of perhaps early boundaries.
That'll be a point I have to sort of like think more about. As I say, a lot of this is just like a new synthesis for me, because there is an ambiguity there of whether it's like an augmentation or amplification of it, or whether it's the actual just the motor of it as such, and it's sort of quasi-continuous repetitions. So that is an excellent question, and yes, it's absolutely something to think about, particularly with respect to the sort of connection I'm making to recursions, which do come back into themselves in order to amplify to some degree themselves.
Do you think that some of the interesting assumptions during it, fears that people seem to have about artificial intelligence or cybernetics is that it's not a compulsion to the death drive, compulsion to life, or idea or
Well, death and life aren't, like in the normal sense of the word, do become very ambiguous in the sort of ambit of the death drive. Hence, that aspect of the sort of like the fear associated with the uncanny of mechanical or seemingly inanimate objects behaving in animate ways. I mean, his big example is that Hoffman story, The Sandman, in which, among many other things, the protagonist falls madly in love with an automaton. So it becomes sort of like in the usual sense of death and life in this situation does become at best ambiguous. Is this another question that I'm not answering correctly?
it's important.
Yeah, sure. No. I'm happy to do so. I'm just beyond the pleasure principle. I mean, there are many weird texts by Freud, particularly stuff on telepathy, which seems to be taken very seriously indeed. But this is a particularly weird one. In his analysis of beyond the pleasure principle, Derrida and the postcard refers to something that he calls la vie, la mort, as this sort of like operation, literally life, death, as a sort of like the, again, sort of ambit of death drive there. So, as I yeah, so it's not as simple as that. So it could be. I mean, people are frightened of all kinds of these sort of contemporary technologies for all kinds of not always bad reasons. So, no. Okay, this is the part where I'm critical of Freud. So I'm very much not like a. You'll notice that the word Oedipal complex did not come out of my mouth once, and it doesn't often. And so there are, in particular, his ideas of childhood sexual and psychic development I find problematic from any number of situations. So I mean, that was sort of like that was more on the nature of an aside. When he's talking about sort of like how one goes through sort of an oral drive and an anal drive, and then eventually the magical mysteries of the genital drive. Yeah, I don't quite. I can buy like an organic vesicule suddenly scissioning itself off from an inorganic milieu, but somehow this sort of developmentalism I find a little bit harder to take. It's a different mode of causality, absolutely, and maybe because there's an aspect of where cause and effect seem to happen almost simultaneously, and sometimes, an effect can sometimes precede its ostensible, what one might think of its cause. And it's just because it also is like sort of a loop that generates its own effects. So I mean, recursivity isn't the enemy here. So it's just there are certain possibilities that we should perhaps be aware of. Is what is a quasi-political point I would make on this point, or a socio-political point I would make on this question. So. Hi, by the way. Yes. Oh, eventually.
Oh, I just was going to ask, because you said you wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between instinct and drive. And
Oh.
Maybe it's good for those of us who are thinking about drives to not just be kind of very simple.
Oh, yeah, sure. An instinct is like a biological preset. It's because we are sort of mammals that we are, and so the various like fight or flight is a good example of just something that's sort of organically coded into us. That's a bad way of putting it, but just sort of like it's a sort of just sort of like a default. Whereas a drive, and it's sort of once it's achieved its aim. So in the case of like fight or flight reflexes, the threat is either I've run away from it or I've gotten rid of it, either stomped on it, then it's over. And I mean, it may recur, as in the case of like hunger instincts or sexual instincts, but they achieve their own satisfaction and then stop altogether, whereas drives keep repeating themselves, and that is the source of their satisfaction. And I mean, if you wanted to further complicate things in the sort of like Lacanian notion of desire, which is a third thing altogether, it never finds its satisfaction. So that's how. So I think, yeah, that's instincts and drives basically. So, Cecile.
I was wondering about this myth of origin.
Yeah.
In Freud and in cybernetics. It seems to be an analogous myth, which is the complete death of the recurse. And the idea that could be a continuation of the idea of the death driver, because the recursivity, that the aim to self-regulate in order to stave off entropy,
Mm-hmm.
only produces spits out more entropy into the universe, and in a way almost accelerates. In theory, at least in this kind of
In this, yeah. Sure. It is true that entropy was sort of the great bugbear of the cybernetic movement. It was the one thing they didn't want to happen. Now, this gets a bit beyond sort of the actual topic, but I do wonder how it would be possible for digital technologies, in particular, to be anything other than entropic. Now, what I mean by that is, I mean, this sort of sense of like, sort of like an increasing degree of heat and sort of like breakdown generally requires a relative degree of openness in a system. And I've argued this somewhere else, that, I mean, so McLuhan's idea of like the sort of television electronic image as a mosaic, as like sort of parts against a sort of like background, fragments against the background that we put together in a sort of gestalt manner, allows for that kind of relative degree of openness, whereas a digital image being sort of binary data processing, that's all, doesn't have that level of openness, because, how did I argue this again? Because it is pure structuration at a certain level. It is really differences without positive terms, and so it doesn't have that ground on which the sort of like the mosaic structure of the electronic image would be. So that's sort of something I've argued somewhere else, but it's, I think, might be related to what you're asking. So yeah. Just, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah. Sure.
Just kind of
Speaking of heat death, you'll excuse me for a
Yeah.
minute.
There's something about the aspect that you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, there at one point you were kind of like, oh, you were proposing the potential that it was like fortuitous or maybe you were, but there's a kind of causality that's called bottom up story. That's like physical, chemical dynamics that might have accidentally given rise to this kind of thing breaking off and creating its own boundary, and then you talk about this other kind of causality, which you might call top-down boundary conditions. I'm curious how that comes up in maybe the.
Okay, sure. The sort of, again, in philosophy of nature, the idea that there are only physical chemical processes, and that's it. This was this sort of like 18th century liberation from sort of more theological or Aristotelian notions of nature. Who wrote Man and Machine? Lemaitre, I think. Anyways, and that's it. That's all there are. Bergson, among others, disagrees with this, postulating a kind of like life generative process or generative principle. Norman Wiener suggests that it's neither nor, or that they sort of fold into each other with the idea of the mechanized inorganic. So now, as I say, in terms of the question of causality and temporality, I mean, I guess this has to do with the question of entropy, actually, because that was generally the idea in the 19th century, Maxwell and people like that, that the universe goes one way, and you can tell, or the temporality of the universe is unidirectional, which is towards ever-increasing entropy, unless you can kind of stave it off for a while, but towards a kind of de-differentiation. So, or undifferentiation, this sort of thought experiment of the sort of demon, Maxwell's demon. Cybernetics, in its attempt to sort of like emphasize its negentropic aspects of it, does seem to be working very much against that in its sort of emphasis on recursion. So the physical chemical stuff is basically is sort of like the extremely mechanistic, maybe Newtonian, certainly the idea of there being just purely physical processes, which was sort of a necessary step, one might argue, but one that's perhaps been superseded. I mean, sort of idea that animals are just machines of some kind, for example, and things like that. So certainly in environmental thinking, it's sort of regarded very negatively. So.
Is the net causality, I guess, because there's a way to talk about it in comparison, I would say that it's like, if this other kind of causation, it's not bottom up, it's sort of, that's inherent in pre-living universe that exists forever. But then there's I think in cybernetics, I can't quite tell, but I'm curious, but that it seems like there's this suggestion that there's a foundation of sort of physical chemical dynamics, and then fortuitously they come together just purely within those dynamics. They come together and a new regime of causality emerges, and then eventually that will go away and it'll return to the physical chemical thing, or is there sort of in between, or a sense that there's like this kind of causality, or just the troubling question where it's like it's potentially wasn't just fortuitous coming together of physical chemical conditions, but there's actually a kind of
Underlying principle.
Perceived in it, it's responsible.
That is, I think, what Freud would argue about the latter section, that there is a sort of like a primordial pre-organic drive, as it were, that affects organism. The notion of cybernetic causality does seem to depend a great deal on, at a certain point, certainly a sort of, not necessarily fortuitous though, because it is very much like it's goal-directed, like sort of these machines, quote unquote, are built for purposes, even if that purpose is, I mean, like machine learning or something like that, or like the homeostat. So, I mean, I'm not sure it's all chance with cybernetics. I don't think they would say that there's just kind of like random, sort of like happenstance. But it's a tricky question, certainly. I actually kind of wonder whether cybernetics has a fully articulated theory of temporality sometimes, but. By all means.
I'm just curious if that's you think it's coming yourself that's going in one direction or another, exponentially faster or slower, or if you're thinking of these concepts as things that emerge and recede.
When thinking about positive feedback loops, there is an intensification involved, so there is at least an implied trajectory there. And if death drive is sort of a particular subset of recursion more generally, then yes, there is the possibility of a similar amplification. Now I know there's a great deal of literature on sort of emergent phenomena and things like that. Consider like ideas of autopoiesis, for example. But yeah, I think in this case I am sort of thinking about not a sort of yeah, there is a kind of sense of not necessarily like A, B, C, D, E, F, G kind of trajectory, but a sort of more tendential one that sort of like relates back to itself and sort of like sustains and enhances itself and augments itself. So I think okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for putting up with that.
People will take a little break.
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm going. Yeah, I need a cigarette, so I'll be back. Oh God, yeah, I should, shouldn't I? Yeah.